Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is a big part of the problem I think we saw in this last election, that Democrats thought they had the votes of all Black and Latino people in the bag, just as a matter of course, and of course that didn't turn out to be true. I mean, they still got, certainly, the overwhelming majority of the Black vote. That's a very long term historical trend that's going to take a long time to turn around, but it was still a smaller majority than it has been in the past. Trump actually made demographic inroads in all sorts of groups. So I mean, that's definitely proof of concept of what you're saying. And of course, some people will hear all of this as what's sometimes called class reductionism, being indifferent to or in denial about the existence or importance of racism, and that's not at all the point. You don't have to be um, indifferent to or in denial about about racism or any of these other things to see that class divisions exist within all of these demographic categories, and ideological divisions certainly exist within all these different undifferentiated categories. And you need to make those differentiations. And in fact, really, I mean, it's incredibly like it's a strange and condescending exercise, the way that these this displacement function that you're talking about, that, because of course nobody wants to say, as a liberal academic, that who might, like Judith Butler, support, Kamala, have supported Kamala Harris's, run for president. Nobody wants to just say, look, I'm a liberal. I think that I don't support Bernie Sanders because I think he's too far to the left. I disagree with that, and just leave it at that. That's like a very unsatisfying rhetorical posture,
Right.
especially for people who see themselves and who see their theoretical contributions as linked to some sort of anti-establishment project. It's much more satisfying to be like, hey, I identify with the really, like the most oppressed people in society,
Yes.
and that's why I have these politics. Even though, I always love pointing to polling data, since if if you really want to take, even putting aside everything that we just said about internal differentiation within different groups of the population, if you want to, if you see yourself as serving the interests of some demographic subgroup, then one would think that the first step would be to look at the data to see what people in that demographic subgroup say that they want,
Hmm.
and then see how you can deliver that for them. And shockingly enough, in every poll of Black and Latino voters, the top issues that they always reference, as these are the most important issues to me, are things like jobs and healthcare, because they're people, and those are the issues that are most important to most people, because they have the most obvious, the most obvious impact on their lives. And there is a separate discussion to be had, for
Yes.
sure, about why, why the left has some of the roadblocks that it has in
Yeah.
getting through on those issues where our program lines up with most people's preferences. But maybe they don't take us seriously as a vehicle to achieve those preferences. But this business about staying in your lanes, right? It's
Yeah.
that you're that it's wrong to to speak out on certain issues, if you have a certain background. I mean, in
Mm.
the interview you mentioned there are two things going on. One of them is this like ridiculous claim that Bernie Sanders is an ineffective politician because, as a political minority of one, within the Senate, he hasn't like he hasn't co-sponsored a
He
bunch of
hasn't
major,
passed bills.
yeah, yeah,
Right.
that
But of course, he's that's never been his shtick. His shtick was always the amendment, right? And if you, on that metric, there's probably very few senators that, even in the history of the United States, have come close to his amount of influence in passing legislation.
Yeah, I mean, he was the when he was in the House, he was the Amendment King
Amendment King. Yeah.
of Congress. He was called that, and this was Newt Gingrich's Congress. It was deeply
Right.
hostile political territory,
Yeah.
but he was still able to get an enormous amount of amendments through to do things like
Mhm.
expand community health centers, build more hospitals for veterans, really concrete measures like this, which was just a smart strategic way to use what power he had, again, as somebody who doesn't have a lot of ideological allies, in that institution. But then, like, the other part of what the interviewer was saying about staying in his lane has to do with what you said about Joe Biden is building such a diverse cabinet. Now, of course,
Yeah.
we all know this is extremely selective. I don't remember any liberals getting very excited when George W. Bush appointed the first black Secretary of State, as Colin Powell, for example. It's only it's only exciting on in 2008. Every liberal woman that I knew was mocking the absurdity of the idea that she would that women had some sort of obligation to vote for McCain Palin because Sarah Palin was a woman. So it only comes out in certain contexts, but in those contexts, when it does come out, when it's Democrats, when it's liberals, this is treated as profoundly important. I mean, even relatively good congressmen like Ro Khanna justified his vote for the waiver for Biden's defense secretary, which is something that
Yes.
Norm Bustingly is somebody who needed a waiver, because he was in the military, active duty military, so recently,
Yes. Mhm.
and he justified that vote on the grounds that representation is so important, which clearly, I mean. I mean, it's kind of silly on its own, right? It's like, what, this is the only black man in the country who could have this job. It has to be him, for the representational victory. But this thing about lanes, gets
Yeah.
into a related concept at the intersection between the academic things you were talking about
Hmm.
and political, and what we mean by
Exactly.
identity politics. And yeah,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. You're right. And I don't, it's hard for me to sort of even begin to diagram out the causality here, because I think, as much as I have respect and admiration for writers who take this on, I think there is a tendency to ascribe blame to specific academics and intellectuals as if they are somehow the mastermind or cause of the influence of intersectional concepts of intersectionality and whatnot in our movements today. And I guess the way I approach it is I'm a little bit more of the mind that the influence of these ideas is downstream from economic transformations. I think the academic shift and the shift in the movements are downstream from the kinds of phenomena that you would see, for example, described in Adam Curtis's documentary Hypernormalization, where, of course, the 1970s bequeaths us a world where the left ultimately is defeated. And it's our, to bring in Jameson and Zizek and people like this, excuse me, there is a difficulty now that our sense of collective agency has been so destroyed that we can't even imagine an alternative. That, as they famously always say, it's easier to understand the end of the world than it is to understand the end of capitalism. So, coming at the question then symptomatically, I think what you can start to see is a left that actually doesn't really believe change is possible, and is actually then without any sort of solid footing in the possibility of real change and working towards real change. Instead, what we do is engage in various forms of posturing that uh, you know allow us to appear like we're morally, um, you know, uh, full, broad spectrum human beings, but actually maybe at the same time not actually be able to deliver very much in terms of substance. Um, and I think when that is called into question, that's when you get pushback, because there's an entire edifice in academia built around that. it's not necessarily Judith Butler's fault, right? I mean, obviously she's invoked a lot. Hey, if you really wanted to think about the scholars that are probably most to blame for this, I would say it's Laclau. But that it's that kind of neo-Gramscianism, actually, arguably, which might get me in some hot water. But reading them, they're the ones that, in a sense, mapped out for us in the 80s and 90s the kind of third way socialist. Right, that those words shouldn't go well in the same sentence together, but they actually kind of do. But that third way socialist approach was quite completely delineated by them. Judith Butler, I think, is probably not the one that we ought to be going after here. Although that doesn't get her off the hook for sponsoring Kamala Harris so generously in the election cycle. Her work, I think, doesn't. It's hard for me to see necessary connections between her work and the decision to support Kamala. I think, in a sense, we're all, her actions in her personal life. I mean, I don't know how you feel about this, but I don't know that our personal political commitments are always necessarily reflections of our abstract intellectual commitments.
Sure,
so I don't know. But yeah, I mean, so yeah, probably there's probably some people wanting to throw shoes at their screen right now for me saying that. But I
I mean,
just the way I see it, there's a famous clip where Zizek says, like, if I can't do Zizek impersonation very well, Ben, but he says, like, don't blame Judith Butler for the movements today. That they Judith Butler is the person that always said to us that our identity is a performance, and there is no kind of essential there. So it's very strange to sort of hear her being the target of ire from some leftists, under the assumption that she somehow is the cause of these sort of notions of essentialization. That's not true. It's if you want to understand where the contemporary notions of hegemony come from that drive and animate the left today, you're going to have to start looking at people like Laclau, because they're the ones that talk about reframing Marxism so that it's no longer just a question of the hegemony, democratic hegemony of the working class, but the democratic hegemony of as broad a spectrum of groups as possible. So really, they're to me the kind of origins of the problem. I've kind of drifted from your question?
No. I mean, I think those are certainly fair distinctions that, of course, nobody, I mean, we shouldn't be surprised by anybody acting politically in ways that might not reflect their abstract theoretical commitments.
I'm not going to die on that hill, by the way. I'm not going to die on the hill of defending Judith Butler. So don't at me online, right? I mean, my commitments lie elsewhere.
Jesus, Nicholas, if you love Judith Butler so much,
just go back to Ireland where you came from and whatever. Anyway.
But no, I mean, that's totally fair. But I think that, and with any of these people, whether the the theoretical rationalizations are downstream from the cultural and political shifts, or in some cases contribute to them, it is useful to engage with those rationalizations, I think, for a couple reasons. Most obviously that it helps us put our finger on a sort of fuzzy sense of what people might be saying or thinking. And so if we can put a name on the ideas and try to think about what they might mean, that's helpful for pushing back against them, even if the academics aren't really, I mean, we don't want to fall into a left-wing version of the, Jordan Peterson fantasy that, like everything that he doesn't like, that, that some, so-called SJW want to call, does, or that he doesn't like in larger culture is somehow the fault of, academics that he doesn't like. So that's a very fair distinction. But the theoretical, rationalization, at least for this idea, that it's important for people to stay in their lane, right?
Yeah.
Which is something
Yes.
I see all the time, all over the place. Like as we're having this conversation,
Mm.
I've just been seeing that uh, so Jimmy Dore, who I think is kind of an idiot, is trending on Twitter because of a sort of exchange that he was having with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez about
All right.
bringing Medicare for all to, or demanding as a condition for supporting Nancy Pelosi for the speakership that she bring
Right.
Medicare for all to a vote, which wouldn't actually mean, of course, that there's any version of the scenario where we get Medicare for all.
Yeah.
But Dore thinks that Dore thinks that there's like a strategically good reason to do this, because that would force some people who might be hedging their bets on the issue to take a clearer stand. And who knows, maybe he's right, I'm not sure. But I don't, I mean, I have, maybe you can make a case for that. I mean, I don't, I don't tend to think that his takes are often, the result of deep reflection, but who knows, broken clocks. Uh, but I then, okay, whatever you think about the Jimmy Dore issue, I've then been seeing people responding to it by saying, "Oh my God, look at these white leftist Bernie Bros criticizing the squad that's made up of women of color. This really
Yeah.
shows
Right.
this really shows us something."
Yes, you're
Uh,
right. Yeah.
and that's the same idea as the stay in your lane stuff,
Right.
which in academic ease is what's sometimes referred to as standpoint epistemology. That
That's right.
that people that well, actually, you want to? I
Yeah.
could give my gloss
I
on
can
what that is,
probably
but do,
I can probably jump in there with a little bit. So that's something that's very much a preoccupation of mine right now. Standpoint epistemology has been around for a long time, and the interesting thing about it, I think, is that it's always been a very marginal sort of presence. It's certainly, you can see it in some strands of feminism, by no means all. Uh, and the basic proposition is that you have to have an experience of a certain marginal position in our society before you can speak truth about it. And these kinds of concepts, standpoint epistemology, then are kind of really the ones that are at work when we start to try to think about, common leftist complaints about things like the oppression Olympics. So obviously what's going on there is the idea that, okay, if I have an experience of one marginal position in a society, but then maybe I have another foot in another kind of experience that's marginal. So say I'm I don't know, Hispanic, say I'm gay, say I'm, you can start to add them up. Maybe I have some kind of um, disability of some sort, right? So there, that have three potential places and experiences from which I can speak. That adds up to a kind of an injury calculus. And then I am able to because I've experienced much more kind of marginality than other people who might just be Hispanic or just be gay, then I have a sort of a greater authority to speak. So the standpoint epistemology, of course, starts from a very interesting place and probably a useful place, which is, of course, like, yeah, I can't speak for any person really other than myself in a way. Um, but it can end up in a sort of a political territory where it informs highly perspectival assessments of politics that I think, um, when pushed to an extreme, can run contrary to the broader intuitions of the left, which are not necessarily to do with what divides us and what gives us our singular standpoint, but how to generate a collective, a necessary collective standpoint that we can leverage in order to engage in change. So it's the problem, of course, is then on the table. It's a problem of strategy. How do we build strategy out of a political perspective that is so preoccupied with micro injuries, and which of course are very valid and worth considering, but don't necessarily give us that political leverage. So the standpoint epistemology thing then, as I've been sort of observing it framed in academia, and I think it was very, very clear in the stay in your lane argument that came out after the election, because there's a lot of things we can say about that election. The way the black vote shifted, the way the Hispanic vote shifted, the fact, for example, that fewer white men supported Trump proportionally this time around than last time around. So that data does create a certain complexity. The fact that Kamala Harris does come from such a PMC background and doesn't at all seem to be someone who has in her politics a particular sort of compassion for the poor. So we find ourselves with all of these sorts of data points that are they're not hard to find. They're very readily available if you're just willing to do a little bit of research, confronted with this reaction where any kind of criticism of her is responded to with stay in your lane. And that is why I feel we need to start talking about something that I'm actually very uncomfortable talking about, which is what's going on in academia that it must disavow its class position, like that it has to create these repeated focuses on identity positions rather than engage in a transformative politics. Because I don't see these insistences on staying in one's lane as in any way transformative at all. They are, in fact, in a way, pillars of the status quo. Those are rhetorical gestures, discursive gestures that only seek to affirm and underline the status quo.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think look, I think there are also a couple of maybe more simple-minded criticisms that you can make of that posture. One of which is when because if somebody was listening to you say that, and they might say, well, hold on, but I'm not I'm not defending the status quo. I want people to defer to the most oppressed people, people who are treated worse by the status quo. How could that be defending it? But of course, oftentimes in practice, it's used to defend the horrible politics of establishment figures, that directly tax the status quo. And even when it's being used in the context of saying, oh, nobody who's not member of oppressed group X should have opinion on form of oppression X, which at best is a kind of weird unilateral disarmament, because the only people who would listen to that advice are people who are on your side and who acknowledge that oppression is very bad, right? Like,
right.
No, no man who's opposed to abortion will care, that is not in his lane, right? But men who are pro-choice, might care, and so it's a weird, can be this weird form of unilateral disarmament. But then the other thing is that has to do with what you were talking about with the oppression Olympics, that this, even if this was invented, for the sake of, a certain kind of, I don't know, left liberal or radical liberal, perspective, it's super easy for anybody to pick up this framework and use it for their own purposes.
Yeah, I think so.
I have seen, feel like I'm just about to go into the rant from Blade Runner. You wouldn't have believed the things that I've seen, but like I've seen people who are like woke Zionists, saying that they don't want Gentiles to goy-splain anti-Semitism to them. That if they say that this advocacy for the Palestinians is anti-Semitic, then you should just defer to Jewish people on that question. I've seen the children of wealthy Venezuela, emigres exactly. Saying, another white American leftist, who's going to tell me that I'm wrong about Venezuela. And if you see what's wrong with that, it's very hard. I know there are ways that you can try to twist and contort and explain why those uses of it are not okay, but your preferred uses of it are. but it seems like a much more promising rhetorical posture to say, look, it might be true that on certain specific issues that that people gain some insight into them by having certain sorts of experiences,
Right.
but um, like we're much better off just arguing for the positions that seem to be correct, and not playing this game of extreme epistemic deference.
Yeah.
And it's also worth highlighting a point of connection between this and what we were talking about earlier, that this deference game only works, it only even makes sense on its own terms if it's combined with a pretty extreme form of essentialism, uh,
Yes.
because if not, right, like if you take seriously the idea that, yeah, there are more Black people in the United States than there are people in Canada, and nobody would say, hey, we should just defer to the Canadian perspective. We should just think what the Canadians think, because they would immediately realize that the Canadians don't all think the same thing.
Right, right. I mean, I can give you a great example. I'm actually going to be doing a little bit more work on this on my show in the coming months. But earlier this year, in my discipline, in my field, in international relations, we had a major controversy break out over what was alleged to be hashtag deepfake methodology being used against some theorists of security, or security theorists, if you will, in Denmark. And these guys are very well known scholars. I mean, I would have read their stuff when I was in grad school. Like they would not in any way, shape, or form really be people who embody my politics. They'd be fairly liberal, mainstream guys, but I would never sort of say that they were um, acting in bad faith or being essentially racist in any way, shape, or form. But some work was published this year, which really did a hatchet job on these guys, and it was basically kind of the bottom line was, look, that because they don't approach the question of security from a subaltern perspective, they are not they're effectively being racist, and it was said in black and white in the piece. Now, and there was some humming and hawing, like in the piece they're like, well, we're not saying they're racist people, but their work is, and because it has these blind spots, whatever. But at the same time, it struck me at the time that um what was being assembled here on was kind of in bad faith, that these guys had never really set out to portray the world perfectly. I think they would have been, and in their work, they would acknowledge many, many blind spots in good faith. Their politics wasn't a post-colonial kind of operation, So, in a sense, like, going after someone in this kind of like way where you kind of try to find the receipts in their work, but you're kind of having to reassemble them, and your warrant for doing so in the way that you're choosing to do so is basically standpoint epistemology, right? But what it was two white women trying to represent these post-colonial subjects and the presumed subjectivity of these post-colonial subjects from this essentialized position, and then using that as a critique, as the basis of her critique of this white Anglo-European perspective on security. And it just struck me as being incredibly complicated once you actually started to pull back the lid on how these two scholars were actually giving themselves permission to speak on behalf of this post-colonial subject.
Yeah,
It was very strange.
yeah. I mean, look, I'm an atheist, but if hell exists and I go there, I strongly suspect that it's going to be full of white liberal academics accusing other white liberal academics of being implicitly racist, in a cycle forever.
Yeah.
So yeah, fair enough. People should check out both the audio essay that we're talking about, which was right after the election, and the rest of what Nicholas says. He, his podcast is well worth listening to. I had not been listening to it. Even though, actually, by the way, I should say, when we were talking before we started, we realized that Nicholas and I had actually met each other
That's
a
right.
few years ago when I was a delegate for Central New Jersey DSA at the DSA convention in Chicago, and Nicholas was already there, but he's only been on my radar as far as media relatively recently. But I heard our mutual friend Adam Proctor did a very in-depth two-part interview on Nicholas's podcast, Fully Automated, which was a really interesting listen,
Thank
and I
you, Ben.
really wanted to get Nicholas on to chat with me a bit here. I hope for the first of many times. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Ben. It was an honor. Thank you.
Thank you.